This is a paper that Emma Vast and I, actually it's just recently published in Information Systems Research. What you will note from this is, though it's quite distinct from the other papers, is that it's not on AI. These are not machine learning algorithms of any kind, but our setting is important. Why? Because we are talking about what some people might say, is it the future of work? Is it already here? Well, actually, it's been here for a very, very long time. I'm talking about open source here, right? And these developers have been working in online settings where algorithms are their normal, everyday, this is what they build. This is what they work with. And these are the tools that they use. They would call them tools. So we're looking and trying to argue the question of augmentation or automation, which is better, because there's a big debate right now, which is better. It should be augmentation, but in our case, you might find that there's something slightly distinct here. And does it make a difference? And I'd like to put it out now before I run out of time at the end, that does it make a difference if the people who are building the software are also using the software simultaneously? And I've got examples that aren't from what we're going to present today, but from the Physics Society, but also from surgeons as well in the UK here, where we see similar issues. So this is not only about software development or open source. So our motivation, if you look at open source literature, there's lots of conversations about, oh, it works, we don't know how it works, but there's beautiful work, of course, by Howson and Krausten and then Lindbergh et al. So lots of people trying to understand, how is it that open source development actually happens? I mean, it's a distributed setting with lots of developers, very few face-to-face interactions. I wouldn't argue that there aren't any, but they are quite few and they don't happen as often as probably they would want. So of course, it relies on issues of modularity and parallel development, and these are essential to software development. However, literature also indicates to us that there are problems of over-modularity, where you get common coupling and residual interdependencies arising, but also under modularity, where unorthodox modularity begins to arise. So how can one actually resolve these questions? Because clearly these open source developers manage to build expert systems online that are used by millions of people around the world. So it does work. And then we've also got other scholarship that says, well, actually modularity only offers flexibility within modules, but not across module behavior. So how can we understand it? This was our question coming into our research. Well, they use algorithms, not just what they're building. Of course, I'm sorry, I should preface this, that Emma and I were looking at the Linux kernel development case. But we're not talking about Linux itself being built. We're talking about all the tools or to use our language, algorithms that are used in order to build Linux code, right? So looking at version control software and all the other algorithms that they have had to build over time in order to make their system go from just a stable system where parallel development modularity do function as they should, towards resilience, to greater resilience. So they rely on algorithms, multiple algorithms, but algorithms and their interactions, because one algorithm doesn't work on its own. It has to interact with multiple other algorithms and with the human element, the wonderful developers, right? The idiosyncratic and very egotistical developers. Things don't happen as planned. So even though an algorithm is just a line or lines of instructions that are supposed to fulfill a certain goal or accomplish a task at the end, why is it that they don't always do that? Why do things break down? Why do sometimes things surprise you a little bit as well? So it's the interactions between different algorithms that actually give rise to unpredictable results. So this gives rise to our question: how do algorithmic interactions shape open source software work? And well, okay, so we're looking at algorithms and they help developers. So they augment. So in a very basic sense, going back to Engelbart in 1962, augmentation is the extension and amplification of human capacities. Sorry, I'm just trying to change my screen setting so I can see all of my slides. So augmentation, literature argues nowadays that actually we want augmentation. Don't lose the worker. We don't want to have a situation where the future of work begins to look so bleak that we have no people who are actually working and they're destitute, because we still need to live in a world where we work in order to be paid and survive. So a lot of literature talking about augmentation, not automation. and also some very nice work coming out, which is theoretical. Augmentation and automation are sequential processes. So these, Reich and Krakowski have a wonderful study where they say, well, actually you augment first, right? So we use technology in the workplace to help us do our job. And over time, we begin to understand and learn the technology so well that we understand which parts of our work perhaps we'd be absolutely happy to automate further. So we automate more. There are people in the same department that are playing catch up, and then they have to learn the system, how this is augmenting the work, and so on. So it's sequential. We have augmentation, then automation, then augmentation. Okay, that's a very, very important perspective, and at least it doesn't disqualify the fact that automation is also very relevant in organizations. But then we looked at automation literature as well, and then we were really struck by this paper by Bainbridge, but other people, and Paul Leonardi mentioned some work by Igbia as well about how, well, actually, you know, humans are also helping technology as well. Yes. As well as Igbia argues, but also as Bainbridge argues, that there is a paradox in this, because the people, no technology works on its own. So there's nothing that's fully automated usually, because it still needs maintenance work. It needs some operators, as Bainbridge calls them, to make sure that the technology functions over time without breaking down. But what they don't argue, or what they don't really bring to the forefront, is how much of the work that is done by these operators, and even what Igbia argues quite strongly, is these are menial workers, this is invisible work, and this is not, it's okay, you know, that technology does the work, but we don't want to make our humans become invisible. I won't go into methods for shortage of time. So it is a qualitative study. It's on the Linux case. We collected lots of email messages, and then we followed that up with some in-depth interviews with some very influential developers and important people that we had seen in our conversations, email conversations, and asked them very pointed questions. Happy to go into that more as needed. So we focused on 3 algorithms and their interactions with each other, other algorithms, and with software developers. The BitKeeper's auto merge algorithm, it's an algorithm that was designed to automatically merge different patches coming from different developers to fix the same problem. And the auto merge algorithm was the decision maker in this case. This is a domain that developers usually keep to themselves. Usually it's their decision as to which patch is better and which one should be included into software. And yet BitKeeper had been designed to actually do this job for developers. And that had varying, all sorts of reactions. Then we had BitKeeper's time sync. This is a very important, a slightly complex algorithm that, as different patches come into the version control software, what timesync does is give each of them a unique timestamp. Now, you'd think that would be straightforward. It's about time. But the problem is these developers are spread across the world, and different patches can come in at the same chronological time. However, it is timesync's job to give each one a unique timestamp, so history can remain true in any branch, so in parallel development. And finally, we also looked at Git hooks, which are about continuous integration, about how can we quickly go from developing software, pushing it back into the main code, and then integrating it and getting it into use. As we all know, open source is all about fast reaction. Well, Git hooks are about testing smaller chunks of code to make sure that a bigger breakdown doesn't happen later on. We focused on different interactions between developers and these algorithms. Now, because we are a little short of time, I was hoping to be able to sort of read some of these quotations to you, but I'm going to summarize. And just so anybody wants to take a look, the paper is already in articles online. So if you really want to, please go ahead and take a look there. What we found is when we looked through our data and we were doing our data analysis, we found multiple different interactions arising between people and, as I said, between different algorithms as well. We began to group them, how they sort of emerged quite naturally towards, trying to fulfill a certain function, solve a certain problem, and so on. And what we noted was, and this is where it began to give us answers about how does parallel development issues that are not overcome, or modularity concerns of over-modularity or under modularity, how do they actually get ironed out by these open source developers? We realized actually is these different interactions that happen and how these developers actually intervene or not in certain cases by building new algorithms or tweaking their current ones. So under managing parallel development, which is our first process, we found categorizing and calibrating interactions, invoking interactions, and then if a defective interaction was made visible, they had to actually move into fixing issues, either by deactivating an interaction or simulating a resolution. But other times it was also about seeking an algorithm that was lost somewhere in the millions of lines of code, or reversing interactions when an algorithm quite accidentally would find an old lost piece of code somewhere and start interacting with it. And the developer was left, why is this even happening? And finally, this is where building resilience is actually became visible to us. We found forceful interactions, extending interactions, and reconnecting interactions. And this is about algorithms that were built through their interactions to actually make sure that everything worked over time. Now, yes, this was still tweaked, so we're not talking about only automation, but we are talking about increased automation at this stage. Again, I do want to give Youngjin enough time. So this is our model. Please don't worry about reading it or being able to read it even. You can just see the three processes. And for each of the interaction, what Emma and I were really looking for in each interaction, what task is being performed, what's the interactional context, the human involved, what is he or she doing, and the design of the algorithm. And these three factors actually related for us to understand what sort of interaction is actually happening. Our contribution. So we have two key contributions. First one we're discussing, which is about augmentation and automation. As I explained when we started out, that augmentation happens, well, yes, we've heard so many people here actually discuss this, that humans use technology to augment their work. They use algorithms, they use different kinds of machine learning algorithms, and so on. And that is taken for granted. However, there is far less work on how humans augment, not just tweaking, not invisible, not menial work, but actual work that is given respect, at least in open source, in the open source setting. And we found that to be also true in eye surgeons, for instance, in the hospital here in the UK. So what we argue for is that augmentation happens so it's a bi-directional relationship between humans and technology overall. And automation is, as Bainbridge argued, and we noted as well, there's no such thing as pure automation. And finally, our last contribution here is, well, the question that was posed by open source developers, in open source literature was, how do open source developers actually manage problems of parallel development modularity? It is not immediately visible. Well, we show it's through different building of algorithms and making sure the interactions remain true over time that actually open source development can continue. Now you'd argue, well, why can't they have greater modularity or fix the issues up front? Well, the big problem in open source is that they have the nature of the work, it requires emergent requirements. You don't have, like you would have in most traditional, even those don't exist so much anymore, but anyway, traditional systems where you build software and the requirements are all clear up front. In open source, requirements are happening all the time because new developers join and they keep saying, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do this? Wouldn't it be cool to add this? So you have a system that is constantly growing and changing. Thank you very much.